Welcome, everyone. I see people are starting to log in. We're just going to give it another minute, and then we will go ahead and get started. Okay, hi everyone. We are right at 11 o'clock. So no, we have a lot of great content to go over today. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. I'm sure people will kind of come in as we go. Welcome. I'm Amy Hashchak. I am National Program Director with Advisix, with where I oversee the consumption practice and help with strategy for everything as a service. Today, we have Advisix Consumption IT as a service model and the business and financial benefits and outcomes for you as customers. There's a lot of really great content today. Um, as you know, as a service and consumption has been getting a lot more traction lately. And I know there's a lot of questions that people have surrounding that. So hopefully we answer a lot of your questions today. But as we go, please feel free to use the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring questions throughout the presentation, and we will be sure to get to those at the end of the presentation. So today, leading the discussion is our consumption practice architect, Dan Goodman. He has 20 plus years of experience, has been doing this for a long time, and is one of our experts in the field. So I am going to pass it off to him to get into a lot of really great content for today. Dan, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Morning, everyone. So again, my name is Dan Goodman, and I'm an architect here in our consumption practice. And again, I'm an engineer, but when we start talking about consumption, it really is a financial model to consume the same technologies that we know and understand today. So with kind of that as the background, a little bit of an agenda, brief introduction to consumption engineering or as a service IT. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the financial models of as a service solutions. And again, the big driver here for a lot of this conversation is the financial model. It's the same suite of technologies that we run today, same hardware, same software. So what is different about it and what's different is how we consume it. How that translates into business outcomes. And again, so this is going to be less about technology and more about the financial model. So how does switching to this model of consumption help drive business outcomes for your organization beyond just the reach within IT, and then other benefits of the solution as well? So again, looking at the kind of the complete picture of consumption engineering or as a service IT and how that translates not just into delivered IT services, but how that translates into business benefits for your organizations. So in 3 sentences, what is consumption? So what it refers to is the way organizations acquire and use IT resources, whether they're hardware, software, or other. So that's the finance side of the house. And then the way those business outcomes you want are achieved. What are those outcomes? Because again, this is a transition from, the second sentence, a shift away from traditional capital intensive IT investments where we're dropping essentially cash on resources to a more flexible on-demand pay-per-use model with a menu of choices of different technologies that allow us to deliver services to our organizations. And then instead of delivering a product, yes, there is still running technology on your floor, but it's no longer about that running product, that running frame, that running server. It's about a service level agreement and delivering on the capabilities, the needed storage, the needed compute power, not just running kit, but actually a service level agreement defining that business outcome for you. And then the third piece here is what that transformation allows us to do. It allows us to shift how we pay for IT. Again, traditionally we've done capital purchasing or financing with very bursty upfront spends, a large upfront spend on an array, multiple years of maintenance to pay and things like that. Switching to this model allows us to align cash flow to actual utilization at the time of utilization. So if you're in a busy business cycle, the utilization goes up and the bill would go up with it. But then after that, when you ramp down, holiday seasons ends or whatever, then that investment shrinks back down to a baseline. So it gives us that elasticity and allows us to mate the current rate that we're paying with the volume of business that is supporting. So very important things there. So what is it again? A couple different ways of looking at it. It's a cloud-like operating model where you consume IT resources metered pay per use, not just buying a piece of kit and sticking a serial number on my floor in a colo. It also includes the supporting management delay. Running kit on the floor, if I can't actually use it, doesn't help me. So making sure that we have an appropriate level of service and management wrapped around these offerings so that they truly meet that business SLA for delivered storage, available processing, et cetera. And then finally, that financial vehicle by which we acquire those resources and how that maps to our organization. I'm going to speak a little briefly here, about the public cloud, and a lot of this is driven by the public cloud, but not entirely. The big thing here is public cloud vendors have kind of defined the market in this way, that they are an OpEx solution, that they are going to market with a service-based offering, where if you go to Amazon for your compute resources, you don't own a computer at Amazon. You subscribe to it as a service. So they've kind of defined the market in that way and work that to their advantage. There are other ways of consuming as a service beyond just public cloud hyperscalers. So that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So jumping straight into it, the first thing I mentioned the financial model, and most of this conversation is financial. CapEx versus OpEx. This is kind of a big deal, right? So a lot of organizations, there's two ways of treating recurring expenses in an IT organization, and those have significant impact, not really on us down here in the trenches in IT, but they have very significant impacts up at the corporate finance office and how they affect corporate balance sheet, forward-looking obligations and things like that. Moving money around the corporate balance sheet, especially given that IT expenses can be such a large percentage of an organization's overall expense, being able to move that money around can be huge. Probably not at your IT level, not at your budget controllers and things like that, but your CFO absolutely cares about this stuff. So the big thing that happened here, though, is CapEx and OpEx. We've kind of heard those words when we're discussing purchases and things like that. The big definition here was kind of a change that changed some things that used to be treated as OpEx as CapEx. And the definition for that here is capital. If it meets these 6 criteria, it's a capital expense. So over 75%, and this relates to leasing. If over 75% of the economic life of an asset is covered by a lease, if the value of the payments are over 90% of the asset value, if you have terms in those contracts for buyout or transfer of the assets, so whether it's a fair market value buyout or a dollar transfer at the end of it, and the added components of right to control that asset exclusively, and it's an identified asset by serial number, that's probably going to be treated as CapEx now. And that's a change. The big thing here is, I'll start with, for a variety of reasons, I don't want to get all the way into market finance and things like that. That can be a very, very deep rabbit hole. But for a variety of business, market, and competitive reasons, organizations have a desire for IT-related expenses to classify as OpEx, to classify as operating expense. Related to what we talked about specifically with hardware, prior to the 2019-2020 timeframe, leasing generally qualified as an operating expense for accounting purposes. So if you wanted to have OpEx, and there are, again, business reasons for those being treated as OpEx, you could just lease the equipment and poof, your hardware investment is now OpEx. Well, we discussed those changes on the previous slide where now most IT leases now qualify as CapEx, even if it's a lease. It meets those criteria around control of the asset, the majority of the useful economic life and economic value of the asset is covered by the contract and things like that. So a high percentage, it's not half, it's more like 90% or more of IT leases became classified as CapEx for your corporate balance sheet. And as we discussed, that can have significant impact on an organization's overall financial picture and financial health, as judged by analyst organizations, as judged by Wall Street, and as judged by their peer organizations. Being able to allocate that money and having what may have been a large operating expense, having that suddenly show up on the CapEx side of your financial balance sheet can have huge impacts and actually move the stock price for your organization. So a lot of the, with that change, the investments in hardware now all being CapEx essentially, we really didn't have a good vehicle to continue to operate on-prem environments as OpEx. And so what do we see? The cloud service providers emerged during this time. Again, those rules were, I believe the initial adoption or the passing of the rules was in 2016. The actual adoption and implementation of the rules occurred in 2019 for public sector businesses and in 2020 for all other businesses. But now that has fully taken effect. Notice how that timeline also very neatly corresponds with the emergence of the hyperscalers and the emergence and the movement towards cloud. What we're seeing is that it really wasn't necessarily that cloud was a better operating model and a more cheap way to get compute and those kind of things. What we saw is the corporate finance officers were saying, we need IT to stay as OpEx. We cannot afford the hit on our balance sheet to have that continue to operate as CapEx. And the only alternative that they could see was, well, we need to go cloud, right? So a lot of times, especially when you see the organization pushing from very high levels saying, we are now cloud first, what they're actually saying is not saying that, we need to get all compute resources from the cloud. It may be, you may want out of the data center business or things like that. There are other reasons for going to the cloud. But a lot of the time, the actual driver for that was, we need IT to stay OpEx, and this is the only way to do it. So the case for the cloud, a little bit against it, but the reason why we like that cloud operating model is, one is OpEx accounting treatment. Again, I keep coming back to that because that is a significant driver in the push for cloud-based resources and for the emergence of as-a-service IT. It has the characteristics of cloud that we like. It's pay per use, it's elastic, we can flex up and flex down. We have a menu of technologies that we can choose from at any point in time. And it's agile. We can spin up and spin down resources quickly, which allows us to get to the business value part of the problem, which rarely lives in infrastructure management, right? But those cloud service providers aren't without challenges. We mentioned that we moved over to the cloud to get that OpEx financial treatment. And that may have been the one driver that ruled all others and said, well, we're doing this no matter what it costs. And in many cases that happened, right? But as we've operated in the cloud, we do have some things that we've identified about cloud operators, which is one, they have a high unit cost. Anytime you're dealing with the ability to move arbitrarily between systems, spin up and spin down, that comes at a resource cost because the hyperscaler or cloud service provider has to maintain that pool of reserve to facilitate that movement and things like that. So tends to have a high unit cost. We call it the agility tax, but that unit cost for operating in that environment tends to be fairly high. The other thing that we find out about operating in the cloud is it has high operating costs as well. Anybody ever been hit by an ingress or an egress charge when they did a bulk upload or an accidental data movement either into or out of a cloud, maybe doing a DR test or spinning up a dev or application environment? Those ingress and egress charges actually can very quickly outstrip the underlying bill for equipment and things like that. The other thing that we see is as we operate in the cloud is not just a compute instance. We need security services, distributed identity management, logins, other layered on services that while they don't directly deliver this service, that provides that baseline cloud infrastructure that we need to operate in the cloud, well, all of those have a cost as well. So in addition to the unit cost of the compute storage network that we're consuming, the operating costs associated with those in the form of service and other charges is also very high. There's risk in cloud service providers in that it's operating on shared infrastructure. So again, you are no longer guaranteed to be isolated on your own equipment and your own gear. It is a shared pooled environment with good rigid security. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but if there are vulnerabilities, unidentified vulnerabilities in other people's equipment and organizations, those could result in exposure to you because it is a shared underlying infrastructure across many customers. The other thing that we see there with it being shared infrastructure is I think the latest one I heard about was, I think just last night, Hulu and Netflix experienced some service outages, and why? It's because the underlying Amazon region was experiencing some difficulty. So, but again, we see those areas where problems in the hyperscaler or problems within individual tenants at a hyperscaler can extend to your infrastructure as well. So that shared infrastructure component does bring some risk for it. Another area that we see challenges in the cloud is limited support for legacy platforms. While we are moving into a cloud-first and cloud-friendly world, lots of IT still runs on mainframe, iSeries, proprietary, large Unix operating systems. The other big side of the house here that we talk about when we talk about the IT side of the thing, that's just one piece of this. What about the OT, or the operational technology side of the house, where they're control units that are embedded inside machines, medical devices, and things like that. A lot of those pieces of technology really don't ever become cloud friendly. They're embedded in physical hardware in your manufacturing floor, in your healthcare systems, in your retail point of sale. So when we look at things, not all things work in a cloud operating model, and we still have to support those things. Governance, regulation, and compliance is another area, and security. Again, those two things, there are a lot of requirements depending on your jurisdiction around data locality, management of data, sharing of data, isolation of environments, and things like that. Those can all be, those characteristics can all be accommodated by cloud, but typically requires more reserved resources, specialist resources, again, at higher cost to accommodate those more rigid security and compliance requirements. So, really a lot of this translates back to cost, but the cloud service model, again, there's parts of it that we like, pay-per-use, elastic, flexible, and there's parts that we don't. Again, it tends to have a pretty high unit cost, risks associated with security, shared infrastructure, and things like that. So how do we overcome that? And again, the last big one here and the big bogey was 4 years ago, we could no longer OpEx our physical hardware plant, and that became a problem for our finance office. So what did we see happen? This is what came onto the scene. So this is where we start talking about as a service or consumption IT that extends not just to SaaS offerings, platforms, Microsoft 365, but now the ability to consume on-prem hardware resources using an as a service model. So enter consumption, enter the as a service IT. What does it do? It brings the best of both worlds. So it is a cloud operating model. The main characteristic, or the important characteristic for a lot of organizations here, OpEx accounting treatment. I get back to the world where I can bring physical kit onto my floor or into a colo partner, but it's treated as OpEx. It's not a capital investment. I retain that flexibility in placing it in operational expense and not have to treat it as capital. I get the other benefits of a cloud operating model. So it's a metered utilization of resource and a pay-per-use model. Even though it's physical kit on your floor, it is still billed by the drip. Per activated node hour, per memory utilization, per processor utilization, per gigabyte or terabyte. It's metered utilization of resources and pay per use at the time of use. Scalable, flexible, and elastic, it retains all of those characteristics of the cloud. Again, we bring additional capacity on the floor that you're not paying for, but that is available for those bursts, for those increases in workload. And as those workloads change, we can adjust the amount of buffer capacity that's available so that you're ready for whatever the business brings to you. And finally, the other power of these as financial vehicles, flexible billing and payment terms. So it's not just by the month, by the drink. We can bill this up front. We can bill it in arrears. We can bill it monthly, quarterly, annually. There's a number of different ways that all of these programs that can be structured to meet your business cash flow needs, requirements, invoicing, and things like that. The next big characteristic here, delivered via on-premise resources again. Your data center or hosted facilities doesn't really matter to us. The idea here is it is still your kit. You get the full performance, high availability, low latency associated with physical kit close to your environment. You get to bring it inside of your own sphere of security and can meet those complex regulatory and governance requirements depending on your organization. It is no longer shared kit. It is exclusively yours. So you're not sharing with other customers and limiting that exposure to errors in other people's environments causing you issues. You get that advantage of locality. Again, we mentioned there's a lot of use cases that don't translate well to the cloud. So whether it's a control network for utility systems, oil and gas pipelines, whether it's a healthcare system where you're dealing with medical devices that are local and installed in facilities for immediate patient care, all of that, or a manufacturing facility where I have sensors or management data associated with equipment, sometimes I have to place that equipment in a facility away from a cloud so I can deal with those locality and data gravity concerns and place the equipment wherever I need it. And again, I get regulatory control. But finally, the last piece of this is not buying a piece of hardware. It's delivered as a service with SLA supporting your business outcomes. I'm not just getting a power store on my floor. I am getting access to 100 terabytes of available capacity at a stated performance point. So what I am now selling you is no longer just running disk. It is actually the service level that says I will have available storage capacity at these characteristics at this time. So moving away from the idea of it being a product that delivers my IT services, and now it is a service with a governing SLA that defines what I'm giving you back. So how does it work? The solutions when they hit the floor, what do they actually look like? So again, main characteristics: elastic capacity that can flex both up and down, metered utilization. The more savings and value-added services, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But when we bring equipment onto the floor, we bring a baseline of capacity on the floor. We have what you see, that committed capacity line and buffer capacity. When we sign these contracts, like anything else, there's a minimum commit value. So that can be 30 or 40% of a storage array. It could be 80 or 90% of a server farm, but there is a level of resource that you commit to utilization as your base bill. And then we see that buffer capacity. So the stuff in light blue is the stuff that we're not paying for. It's there, it's available, we can move into it at any time, but we're not paying for it until we actually consume it. And there's that, the little example there of a burst of workload or a burst of development activity where we started consuming some of that buffer. That bill went up during that period of time. And then as that development activity or activity wore down and baseline utilization returned back to baseline, then the bill went back down to baseline. So again, that concept of elastic metered utilization of a resource. We look at that a little bit farther and we see those growth patterns occur in our environment, and we see a larger peak. And now we also see an increase in utilization above that baseline. Our estate's still going to grow. What we don't have certainty that any individual platform is going to grow anymore. Our overall estate's still going to grow. So as that utilization goes up, this is where we start talking about those opportunities for more savings. Consumption models don't break the common rules of IT finance. There is still financial rewards for committing to larger volumes or for longer terms. So as our workloads increase and that baseline workload becomes more of the resource, we can actually increase that committed capacity and get a unit cost advantage against that larger rate of consumption. So even though our bill will go up because we're consuming more resources, the unit cost for those resources goes down as we commit to higher volumes of data. And then lastly, the other thing that's very nice about these models compared to a true open cloud environment is there's guardrails and swim lanes here. Again, since this is on our premise, generally speaking, we're not dealing with those operational service charges around network ingress, egress, things like that. In terms of resource utilization, the cloud is an unlimited bucket. And I know of customers that have had accidents during development activities where a poorly formed query or a bad application operation spun up a large amount of storage consumption, either through growth in a database or dumping out of files or something like that. Well, in a cloud environment, there's no ceiling on that. And if you quadruple, quintuple, multiply by 100 your storage consumption, the bill at the end of the month will reflect that. Because these are on-prem hardware resources, while they are flexible and elastic, we do still have that guardrail and swim lane of we can't exceed the physical device. So while there is flexibility and elasticity, there is also cost certainty here, where we know that at worst case, if we consumed 100% of the resource, 100% of the available minutes, hours, or days within that billing interval, this is what the maximum bill could be. So gives you cost certainty on both ends. Here is what you pay for the level of service that you get, but also here is the maximum exposure you have in the worst case scenario. Mistakes were made and we consumed all of it. Here's what the bill is for that. And at least we know where the guardrails and swim lanes are. So we mentioned that a lot of what we see in IT has been consistent growth, and old models were built on that growth model where I started at a baseline of utilization. I grew at 15 to 25% per year over the asset life. That was what my growth model looked like. And so, whether it was a lease, whether it was a subscription, we could make a financial model that worked well in that growth environment. What we're seeing nowadays is that growth model is no longer a certainty. We can no longer guarantee that any individual frame, any individual technology, any individual data set is going to grow. They might grow, they might shrink. The overall data volume will continue to grow, but we might see shrinkage where, hey, I'm moving an on-premise application into the cloud, and that's going to take out 60% of my NAS environment that was supporting it. So even though the overall data volume in our environment is continuing to grow, individual frames, we don't have that certainty anymore. And in a capital world or in a traditional acquisition model, there was risk associated with that. What if I bought a frame that 2 years from now I really wasn't going to use much anymore, or the utilization was going to decline rapidly? What if I'm in the middle of a development set of life cycles where I'm bringing new applications and new data online? What if I'm in a growth mode where, as a company, I'm bringing in new companies? How do I deal with those, those circumstances where I may have a sudden need for additional resource, or a declining need for resource, how do I accommodate that? And the answer is, depending on the parameters that we select, Consumption IT supports all of those different growth scenarios. Again, I'll kind of draw two on the left side there. Uncertain growth, where we bring in that base plus buffer capacity. If you experience one of those unknown burst type growth workloads, the capacity is there and is available, and as you consume it, you pay additional money for those resources as they're consumed. If we get to the edge, we run close to that 90% or 100%, we bring in additional buffer capacity at the same rate. So we have the ability to expand that environment. Again, the elasticity of the cloud, where if we need more resource, we can bring it in. We can bring it in at time of service, and we already know the rates. So unlike when it's a capital investment where you've got to go to the CFO and say, hey, I need $100,000 capital investment to expand my storage, and the CFO goes, we ain't got it. This now becomes hey, I need an additional 20 terabytes in my environment. Well, I know the rate per terabyte is X number of dollars. Here's the additional bill per month, and it ends up being a couple of hundred or a couple of $1,000s a month, not $100,000 in June. So it gives us that capability to bring in the additional resources that we need at the time we need them without having to pay those big injections of capital to make it happen. The other model I'm going to point out there is cloud migration, because the reality is a lot of folks are moving data to the cloud, whether it's to as a SaaS provider where, hey, I'm no longer running my own ERP system, I'm subscribing to one in the cloud or things like that. Movement to data to the cloud is real, and it may mean that there's going to be declines in my on-prem storage environment as those applications leave. Well, the challenge with that is I've still got to run that on-premise application with full availability, full security, full performance until the day that it's gone, which may mean I need to tech refresh gear that I know is going to shrink in utilization. And boy, that's usually a bad scene from a financial perspective when we're talking about CapEx investment, because, hey, I'm going to pay full price up front for that unit and use it less and less over time. Well, Consumption IT can solve that problem as well. We can bring in a piece of new kit. We can bring in that more secure, more performant that we need for the next 3 to 5 years as those migrations or development activities occur. So we can deliver that full performance up front, maximum utilization on day one, but we set that commit level down at 30 or 40%. We're paying more for the resource up front because it's, again, in that overage utilization, but we know we're going to decline over time and we still need that secure available kit. So as that utilization declines, so does my bill. As my utilization ramps down, my bill goes down, but I am still operating on new current generation technology with all of the security and performance that I need, but with declining utilization in a way that doesn't hurt my books. So again, we can make consumption work, and it's, again, just changing those assumptions around what do we consider the base capacity, what are our growth rates, what are we trying to accommodate. But there are ways of changing these models and tuning the parameters that we supply to them so that we can have consumption make sense compared to capital in really nearly any scenario. Even scenarios where, hey, for some reason I want to bring in an asset 100% utilized day one and utilize it 100% from day one for its entire life. That's usually a model that would break, the finances of this. But when we start looking at that CapEx versus OpEx, maybe now it's the model where I need it to be OpEx. I need full use of the resource, but I need to bring it in as a service. It can still work even at very high levels of utilization where you might expect the unit cost and things like that to overrun capital. We actually can still beat capital purchase when we start thinking about the future value of money and the ability to spread payments out without high interest rate financing right now. We may still be able to get there with a consumption model. So just because you're not in a continuous growth type environment does not mean that consumption won't work for you. We can build a model that works in nearly any growth scenario. So the next component here, I mentioned everything as a service. We've talked about the ability to deliver hardware. And hardware comes with an SLA. I mean, it's a little bit of a soft, muddy conversation around SLA. Capacity is capacity, right? So that's that infrastructure component, and I bring that on the floor. Maybe I use a consumption model, but I still have infrastructure on the floor. The spiky and unpredictable intervals, that cost of money conversation. I got to pay for capital up front, installation expenses, software, things like that. The other things, though, that I'm going to call out, so that's been the conversation to this point. We also start looking at what else does it take to deliver not just spinning storage, but actually application ready infrastructure, I have all these other tasks. I have infrastructure management around patching, monitoring, making sure I'm available, things like that. I have platform management. I have to maintain my virtualization. I have to maintain the OSs and firmware on all these different frames. I have a data management layer and operational enablement where I have to bring new people on board, handle security, handle help desk. I have to manage those middleware components, the databases, things like that. All of those are infrastructure components. They're necessary tasks. They're mission critical in that if I don't perform them, what happens if my email system gets hacked? But they're also not bringing a lot of strategic business value. Your stock price isn't going to go up just because your email system was patched on time, but it can certainly go down if that system gets hacked. So when we start looking at as a service, maybe we start taking those things, those common operational tasks that are either not core competencies or they're not high business value tasks, and I bring those in as a service. So we look at it as, hey, not here is Kit, here is a set of services and things like that. What level of operation do you want to hand off to a service provider to provide, again, business delivered SLAs, which is available capacity at a performance tier versus a PowerStore 3200 that I have to own, operate, patch, provision, things like that. So we start looking at the as a service conversation as much more than just delivered kit or delivered software on your floor. It also includes those components of operational enablement, platform and data management, and management of the underlying infrastructure so that it truly becomes a handoff service to you. Metered monthly utilization that is fully operationally supported so that the storage and compute resources that you need are provisioned on time, but you're not the one who has to provision them. Again, you do that as a service provider. It is provided to you as a service governed by an SLA, so the business gets what it needs without taxing your personnel beyond what they can support. So I mentioned other benefits. So again, we focus very heavily on the financial aspects of this. And again, most of the conversation around consumption is a financial conversation. It is the same technologies that you know and understand. Now we can extend that and extend that beyond just the technologies and actually begin to interrupt the amount of support that is required for those technologies and begin to take over those functions. But when we start looking at the overall investment, here are the other kind of business benefits that we look at from an ROI perspective when we start talking about consumption versus traditional purchasing vehicles. So number one, that upfront cost of the storage array. I typically mention, let's pretend it's just the normal growth scenario. I have an X number of terabytes today on the floor. I'm going to grow at 20% per year for the next 5 years. What do I need to buy? Well, here's the reality is if you do a 5-year buy on that, when it hits the floor day one, it's probably only going to be 35, 40% used. So I've spent, all that extra money for all that additional capacity that I'm not going to address for several years. In a consumption model, I pay for the resource that I use today. As that resource use expands, I pay for the expanded resource utilization tomorrow, and I pay for it at that time of service. So again, I eliminate that need for a large capital injection up front around a particular array or platform. Time value of money, and also on this one, I'll point to interest rates. So the cost of capital for paying up front right now with interest rates and inflation being what they are, the cost of capital is very high. I can defray that, so I can pay it over time by a lease contract or things like that. But right now, IT leases are running between 9.5% and 11%, where previously you set the Wayback Machine for pre-corona, they were in the 2, 3, and 4% neighborhood. Those additional finance charges can actually amount to 30 or 40% of the total capital cost of a piece of equipment over 5 years. So the cost of money and the time value of money is now a big component of the conversation, where for a lot of the last period of time it hasn't been. So that is another benefit. Again, by consuming as I consume resource at time of consumption, I eliminate those finance charges and other burdens on cost of capital. I consume the resource at the time I use it and pay for it on that schedule. Deployment services, other ancillary things that we talk about when we talk about a service offering, because you don't own the asset, it is owned by the OEM, HP, Dell, Pure, other vendors that participate in this, is that you would normally have to pay for. The asset owner pays for those. So you no longer see separate service and line item charges for associated with delivery, integration, and those other kind of services. Those are now fully integrated into the rate because it is being offered to you as a service, not as a piece of kit. Time to value, again, we look at these things. When you purchase a piece of equipment traditionally, and I'm coming in at 40% utilization, ramping to 85 or 90 over 5 years, the time, to get to actually positive ROI on that can be months and years into the future. It's not really till that utilization comes up over 70 or 80% that I've really fully realized that value of that investment. When I go to a consumption-based model, the time to value is instantaneous. I am paying for a resource at the time I use that resource. So I get full value out of that hardware on day one, only paying for the portion that I'm using of that time. So the time to value goes from being many, many months to years to being many, many weeks to a few weeks to months, where even within the first month or the first quarter, I've already realized the value of that solution because of the way in which I pay for it. Support and maintenance. And again, all of that is integrated as a rate. So all the costs of software updates, patching, hardware break fix, when we deploy this as a service, especially when we extend those services where we're doing the management and operation and monitoring of that platform, again, now I don't have to secure the availability of trained staff, schedule those activities on my own time, make sure they don't conflict with our project work, things like that. All of those support and maintenance tasks are integrated into the service contract, and they're performed for you so you don't have to worry about them. So again, not a direct cash business benefit, but in terms of your flexibility and how your staff can manage their time, the ability to not have those, oh God, a new patch came out that's a 0-day vulnerability, I have to do it now, regardless of what other project work. By moving it to as a service, all of those functions can be outcast and associated with a service, alleviating your staff and freeing up staff time for more mission critical operations. Management and operations, and again, this is not just IT management and operations. I mentioned that, leases and things like that were treated as capital. That also includes a lot of direct cost. It has to be depreciated. It has to be asset tracked. We have to know where it is on our floor. There's procurement associated with CapEx that can be a little bit different than OpEx. So when we talk about management and operations, it's not just the IT management and operations, it's also the management and operations associated with owning a capital asset and having to deal with the depreciation and management of capital assets, asset management and tracking, and the other things associated with bringing in it as equipment that I own versus bringing it as equipment that's owned by an OEM and resident on my floor. Data migration. The other things that we talk about from a soft cost perspective, when we move into the consumption-based models, it is implicit into the contract that as technology changes, we will move that data from the current generation of technology to the next generation of technology as the contracts evolve. So that can occur. Sometimes, depending on the nature of the contracts, we have some that truly are defined as service levels, where the unit of measure is a provisioned VM as opposed to a unit on a frame. In those cases, the data migration can occur in background using software tools. And again, you don't see it. If it is a storage array where we're moving from a current generation power store to a next generation power store, the services to perform those migrations at end of life or at end of contract are included in this. So again, this is a living contract that is designed to move data within a consumable resource, not a group of data assigned to frame ABC123 that I then have to move at some point in the future. It is all handled as part of a service contract, not as a migration between frames. End of life is the other big one. How many times have we had a storage array that's been on our floor for 5 or 6 years, and hey, it's time to go get a new one? We do that. There's still costs in that old storage array because I have to erase it, I have to recycle it, ship it back, all those kind of things. Because this is an asset that is owned by the OEM at the time of its decommissioning, all of the services, services associated with data erasure, hardware recycling, making sure that that equipment is returned and responsibly managed. That is now all handled by the OEM as part of your base rate. So those end of life activities, which can increase the cost of an asset that I've already depreciated and am getting rid of, now I can eliminate all that stuff. All the end of life asset management activities, all the erasures, that's all included in these programs. So when we hit that end of life and I move to the next generation of technology, you can know that you are securely destroying the data that is on those frames so that there is no future risk of exposure, and that those frames are being responsibly recycled at the end of their lives to contribute to that circular economy concept. Last one, and again, depending on your jurisdiction, this doesn't affect everybody, but some jurisdictions, a lot in the Northeast that I know of in particular, have property tax associated with owned assets in your facilities, whether they're IT assets, manufacturing machines, et cetera, et cetera. So if you own it, it's a capital asset on your floor, there's property tax liability to be paid on that. If you move to an as a service model, It is no longer your owned asset on your floor. Those property tax liabilities are now owned by the OEMs who own the equipment. So again, further benefits related to taxation and handling, not just CapEx versus OpEx, but it also allows the ability to take assets off of our books completely against which there may be tax liability. Then a couple other ones that are truly soft. And again, the no refresh cycle and always using the most up-to-date technology. The cool part about a lot of the models here is some of them are subscription to a particular product, but when we get into the service offerings that define not a product, but an outcome, we change out the underlying technologies to achieve those outcomes as necessary. So if we reach a point where current generation gear is no longer performant to deliver the VMs that you're paying for, the service contract governs the removal of that equipment and replacement with next generation. So we're operating on the most up-to-date technology at all at the same time. Unified console for commerce, provisioning, management, and support. So again, all of these offers, regardless of OEM, are supported by an operations and telemetry console so that you have visibility into the environment, understanding what its support availability metrics are, what your consumption rates are at current, what they're projected to be in the future, visibility on the bill and all that. All of that telemetry is built into the program. So, the things that you expect to be there if you own the asset remain there as a service. And then that last one, that last soft driver is capital preservation and resource reallocation to higher value activities. At the end of the day, when we talk CapEx versus OpEx, one of the big distinctions is you spend capital on things that make you money or support the business. Things that are costs, we move to OpEx. So every dollar of capital that we don't spend on a server that's going to be gone in 5 years, that can be spent on investment in the actual production end of the business that's generating money. So again, being able to shift away from capital to operating for IT expenses frees up that available capital for other business value adds. Getting close to the end here. So, the last kind of benefit that we talk about, I mentioned that recycling component, that ESG. So one of the other soft benefits of consumption engineering is it supports improvements in an organization's ESG score. So again, scale with pay-per-use. One of the big dangers is that over-provisioning aspect of buying a large storage array that's only lightly utilized. In a consumption-based or as-a-service model, we can grow the asset dynamically as it grows, limits the carbon footprint, limits both from a power consumption and an excess resource sitting on the floor. So it reduces waste, reduces overspend, improves our asset utilization, which again, all improves our ESG score, improves efficiency. And again, we mentioned that a lot of these things are billed by unit consumption. So storage, storage is burned as storage burned. But when we start talking about servers, the measure there is activated node or activated processor hours. Well, if we turn machines off at night because, for example, our VDI environment, it's busy 8 to 5, midnight to 3 a.m., I don't need most of it, right? So if I automate and turn that off, not only am I improving my carbon footprint by consuming less power, I'm also improving my cost efficiency because those are activated node hours that I have taken out of the pool. I no longer pay for them if I'm not using them. So both cost and environmental efficiency there. I mentioned the components at the end there with that responsible recycling and disposal. So both aspects of it, one, ensuring that a disposed asset is clear of all of your data and so that there's going to be no inadvertent exposures of proprietary or protected information as part of recycling, but also ensuring, again, we're not just throwing this gear in the trash anymore. We are ensuring that it goes back to the OEM for responsible reuse and recycling, whether that's refurbishment and reuse as a new technology platform, whether it's refurbishment for inserting into spare or repair storage pools, or whether it's responsibly recycled and the base metals and things like that are recovered for reinsertion into the manufacturing train. The idea here is that we're reducing the amount of waste that comes out of the IT investments that we make and ensure that they are properly and responsibly recycled, both for economic, environmental, and all the reasons that we want to do recycling for. So all of those things are characteristics of consumption models that directly benefit our ESG scores without having to do a lot of other investments. So again, these can often be a very simple, quick, and easy way of improving your ESG scores as you report up to the various financial markets without having to make huge disruptive change to achieve it. So I've said all that. Why would you partner with Advisix? So, we've discussed the characteristic. There are lots of OEMs out there that offer these programs. Why would you partner with us? So number one, Amy introduced us at the beginning. We have a consumption practice. We actually have a team that focuses only on consumption deals. This isn't just a different way of signing a contract, it's a different way of consuming IT. And we have team members that are focused on enablement and education, making sure that the solutions are designed properly, but also those other aspects of this, legal and operations support. We mentioned that all of this we've talked about financial accounting rules and how it's built as a service. All of that's embedded in legal documents, and anytime there's legal documents, that means we've got to involve the attorneys and make sure that T's and C's are properly negotiated and things like that. The first time you do that, it can be challenging. It's not a short or simple exercise whenever you sign a new master ordering agreement or things like that. We understand that process. We've worked with all the OEMs. It's not our first rodeo. So we have those skeleton contract documents. We understand what customers have asked for in terms of T's and C's back to the OEMs. And we've conducted those negotiations already so that we have a well-worn path that simplifies integrating a new consumption contract. We have over 100 OEMs in our portfolio, and that's important when we start talking about this because HP has a program, Dell has a program, Aruba has a program, Pure has a program, Cisco has a program. All those programs are great, but maybe not everything you need comes out of just one of those programs. We are a partner that can integrate different offerings from a number of different OEMs and provide you that single unified solution and making sure that it delivers and solves your business problem, not just using what one OEM has to offer, but an appropriate solution to your problem, regardless of who offers that solution. We have the experience again. We mentioned that flexible consumption master agreement, new master ordering agreements, service contract schedules, all the things that the lawyers care about that we really don't. We've got a team that deals with it. So we have a contracts person on staff. We have experience doing this. You don't have to go down this road on your own. We've done it for you. Onboarding and solution quoting preparation, all those different tasks to get this off the ground. We've done it before and we have the experience to make sure it goes smoothly. And then lastly, the complementary service. We mentioned that this is an as a service offering, and the idea here being that you consume this as a service with an SLA with those supporting operational and management tasks. We can extend that above the infrastructure layer. So if you're dealing with a Dell, with an HP, with a Pure, they can support the infrastructure, making sure that you're patched and maintained there. But you go to them and say, hey, I need some help with my Oracle environment. They're going to look to you like you have three heads, right? We have those capabilities where we can not just support the underlying infrastructure, but also those software components, middleware, data management layer, where we can take on task management associated with any of those tasks. So well beyond what the OEMs are delivering in support of infrastructure, we can truly make this as a service, everything as a service, the further up the stack we go. And we have a full stack that can support that in ways that individual OEMs cannot. And that was what I had. Amy, do we have any questions that are out there?
We do. Fantastic job, Dan. We do have a couple questions. So it looks like we do have some time remaining, so that's good. First question is, how do you determine the amount of storage needed and the minimum commit amount for a customer interested in consumption?
So I think we mentioned that a little bit on when the slide that had the 4 graphs on it, right? There is still a sizing exercise. Even if you go to a public cloud provider or hyperscaler, to get your best deal, right, you have to go through a sizing exercise where you know roughly what you are going to need. The good news is with consumption is there's still a sizing exercise. The engineers are still involved. We need to make sure that we have the right performance characteristics and the right amount of data volume there, but we take the risk out of it by being able to flex up and flex down instead of the old sizing exercises where, if we were kicking the football, we used to have to land it on the 3-yard line on the right hash. Now with the sizing exercise and the flexibility afforded us, we don't have to hit the right hash anymore. As long as we keep the ball somewhere in the ballpark, we can solve it with the model. So the idea here is it is still a sizing exercise. We still need to collect that information. What is your base level of utilization? What are your performance requirements? How long are we looking to solve the problem for? And then we integrate that into the model to accomplish those financial goals. So with the flexibility of knowing that if we miss by even a factor that can be large, right? If we have a commit of 40%, we have 2.5x the required capacity on the floor with those commit levels. So there are ways of accommodating any level of risk that we want, but we still have a sizing exercise. The moral of the story is we still have a sizing exercise, but that sizing exercise has much less risk in it because of the flexibility of the program. So we do want to be, like I said, need to be in the ballpark. If, for example, just to throw out rough numbers, if we said, hey, I need $100,000 worth of resource, well, it would be an equally bad mistake if you bought $100,000 worth of resource but only needed $10,000. It would also be an equally bad mistake if you bought $100,000 worth of resource and needed $1 million worth of resource. So we still have a sizing exercise. The engineers are still involved. We still want to make sure we get close, but we don't have to get precise close to make the finances work.
Thanks, Dan. One other question. Can you tell me what happens at the end of a consumption contract? What options does the customer have at that point?
Sure. So in all the contracts that I've seen so far, the option number one is on the last day of the contract, you can continue to operate the contract and pay the same rate going forward, basically in perpetuity. Now, we know that eventually those technologies are going to go end of support life and things like that. So once that has occurred, then they're no longer available to you through these programs. There are requirements that what we sell are supportable and things like that. So can't go forever on a particular piece of server, but option one is to just continue to operate under the same terms and conditions that we're available for. More often than not, though, you're going to renew that contract. And when those contracts are renewed, we can either renew and extend on the same equipment that's on the floor, we can renew and extend on new or transitioned equipment, or we can look at the contract overall. Because again, when we start talking about these resources, technologies change and improve and grow over time. And maybe that mix of technologies that's on the floor today is not the one we want going forward. We can change them out at that time. So there is a lot of flexibility in how we handle that end of life. The three options are essentially we can terminate the contract and walk away, and that will invoke all of the data erasure, reclamation, and things like that. We can extend in place, same kit, same contract, same rate for as long as it is supported, or we can renew the contract and then invoke that other side of the house where we do the data migrations and all those kind of things onto new kit for you and continue on a new contract. So many different options for end of life. You're not boxed in. The one that's important though, I will call this one out is, compared to a lease, everybody says, hey, this kind of looks like a lease. What's different about it? The big difference and the reason it's not capital is you don't own the equipment. The one option we generally don't have at the end of these is to keep it and just continue running it on the floor. Because it is sold to you as a service and you don't have perpetual right to the equipment, the good news is that's what makes it OpEx. The bad news is it means you can't buy it out and just run it long in place. So that's the one option we usually don't have, but we have a lot of flexibility at end of contract to either continue it, refresh the gear, or move on to a different technology if necessary.
Awesome. I think that's all that I see in the chat. However, of course, if you have more questions, please reach out to us. Just wanted to say thank you to everyone for attending the session today. We know you're all very busy, so we greatly appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen to the information that Dan shared. I'm sure as you absorb it, like I said, if you have more questions, please reach out to us. We have years of experience in this space and an entire team dedicated to being experts in consumption. So, we're happy to help. We're happy to provide any information you need, and also, set up meetings and talk through what might work best for you and your company. Also, each of you will receive information from this after this webinar to customize a pair of Nike shoes. So be on the lookout for that in your inbox in the coming day. Thank you to Dan for all the great information, and to all of you again, and have a great day.